The US Justice Department dropped a bombshell this week, filing charges against an Indian national in connection with an alleged plot to assassinate what the indictment called a US-based Khalistani leader and a citizen in New York, which is assumed to be the person whom India is accusing of direct involvement in terror, Gurpatwant Singh Pannun, who's of course the person who's been making threats against Indian diplomats and Indian airliners. Now, the indictment or a charge sheet filed in the New York District Court says that the accused, 52-year-old Nikhil Gupta, faces charges of murder for hire. The document reveals Gupta's alleged connection to an Indian official, referred to in the indictment as CC1, who's a former CRPF officer. The US document, however, does not mention the target. According to media reports, as I said, it is Gurpatwant Singh Pannun, who's a separatist Khalistani leader who's both a US and a Canadian citizen and whom India is accusing of terrorism. Now, according to the indictment, CC1 recruited Gupta in May 2023 to orchestrate the assassination. The indictment also suggests that there were multiple individuals involved in the alleged plot, from planning to arranging the logistics. But interestingly, it also references the June 18 killing of Khalistani separatist Hardeep Singh Nijjar in British Columbia, Canada, by masked gunmen. And the indictment essentially suggests a possible Indian role in that killing as well, which ties in with the accusations that Canada has been making. The document suggests that just before Nijjar's killings, there were exchanges between Gupta and his associates, indicating his awareness of the impending killing of Nijjar. Czech authorities, according to the indictment, arrested and detained Gupta on June the 30th in Czechoslovakia, and there is, of course, a bilateral extradition treaty now between the US and Czechoslovakia. So we'll have to see how that actually pans out and whether there will be an extradition to the US. Well, the American indictment immediately prompted Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who's of course gone to Parliament to make direct accusations against the Indian government, to come out and say, well, you know, India needs to take the Canadian accusations also very seriously. But it has to be said that India's reaction immediately to what the US has said has been very different to the Indian reaction to what Canada has said. And the US has been prompt to acknowledge the fact that India has responded in a positive manner to whatever the United States is saying. We've heard Anthony Blinken announcing that we are seeing it as a positive development that India says it is taking these accusations seriously and that it will investigate. And he said that the US will be waiting to see what the outcome of that investigation is. So clearly a lot happening out here, and also clearly a very different response and a very different reaction from India to what the US has said and to what Canada had said in a rather brutal manner a little bit earlier. So what does all of this mean? Where are we going to proceed from here? And what, by the way, does this also say about one question that still remains unanswered? Whatever you may feel about terror plots or the possible, plot to kill and whether that should be done or whether it should not be done, there is another overall question that is hanging over all of this. What happens between friendly countries, between India and the United States, or for that matter, between India and Canada? What happens if there are people who are preaching terrorism or sedition or making threats of violence, who are residing in these friendly countries, who may be citizens of those friendly countries, but who are making terror threats or incitement of violence against India, Indian citizens, Indian diplomats, or Indian interests? Now, okay, you could have the US and Canada saying that it's wrong to come in and assassinate them. They are American or Canadian citizens. But at the same time, the Indian point seems to be fine, but you've got to do something about these. You cannot go on coddling and allowing people who are inciting terrorism, inciting separatism. You cannot continue to give them a free pass. And that was stated directly by the Indian government in its statement, saying Canada, for example, continues to allow and encourage anti-India extremism. So where do we stand on all of this? Let's get in two of the top experts in this field. Lisa Curtis joining us, Director, Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. She's joining us from Washington, D.C. And Arun Kumar Singh, who's been a former Indian ambassador to the United States. Both of them joining us. Thank you so much for being with us, Lisa and Ambassador Singh. Lisa, let me start by asking you this, because I remember meeting you in Washington, D.C. just after the Canadian accusations were actually made. Now this indictment has been published. How do you see this? Where do you think this is going to go from here?
Well, I think this is a challenge to the U.S.-India relationship. I think that both countries will be motivated to try to move past it, to find some kind of diplomatic solution, given the high stakes in the U.S.-India relationship. I mean, Washington and New Delhi both view China as the major challenge, the #1 threat, and they recognize they need each other to manage that threat. So I think so long as India takes the concerns seriously, and I think we can see that so far India is, then I think that we can find a way forward.
Lisa, would you say that a lot of that is happening already? Because let's face it, this person was arrested way back in June, around about the time when the Indian Prime Minister's state visit happened with so much fanfare. G20 happened, the 2+2 is proceeding. So clearly, India and the US at least seem to be indicating that the relationship is proceeding and proceeding reasonably smoothly despite these allegations and charges.
That's right. I think the Biden administration has wanted to compartmentalize this issue, and that's why President Biden moved forward with attending the G20 summit. The two leaders had a very productive meeting. Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin visited India just a few weeks ago for the 2+2. So they've clearly not wanted this issue to disrupt the U.S.-India relationship. But again, I think whether or not it does impact relations really does hinge on whether Prime Minister Modi and his government take the issue seriously and take some action.
Ambassador Singh, if I could just turn to you. We seem to be seeing a very different Indian reaction to what the United States has said compared to the way India reacted to what Justin Trudeau said in Canada. Is it partly because the United States has handled this in a slightly more sensitive manner, doing a lot of talking behind the scenes, but it's Justin Trudeau essentially just walked into Canadian Parliament and accused the Indian government of, assassinating Canadian citizens without producing any direct evidence of one sort or the other? Or is it also because of a different level of relationship between India and the US and India and Canada? Canada, of course, a country which continues to shelter a lot of anti-Indian extremists. How do you see the difference in the two reactions?
I think it's different because of the way Canada and the US have handled it. In the case of Canada, if you see the statements from the Indian side, no evidence has been shared with them so far. And the Canadian Prime Minister made a statement in Parliament, really, in a political sense, highlighting the issue. If they wanted to convey their concern, there are ways to do it. You raise it privately, you do leaks in the media. But for the Prime Minister of Canada to make a statement in Parliament was really raising the ante. So that was one. And if you see the US case, from whatever has come out, it has been raised privately by the officials, by the leadership. There have been leaks to the media. The first leak was done to the Financial Times, not a US paper, a European paper, and then picked up by the US papers. And I think all this was done also because there was a formal indictment coming. And in the US system, once the investigations begin, they have to lead to a formal indictment. And when the formal indictment comes, it will all be in the public domain. So in the sense that ground was being prepared. And as Lisa indicated, I think both countries are working to ensure that it does not really impact the overall relationship. And India has also indicated that it set up a high-level committee, which is going to look into it. But that having been said, one must note that at this stage, it is only an indictment. It's not a conviction.
Well, it's an important point. It's an indictment and not a conviction at that time. But Ambassador Singh, I just wanted to ask you that presumably if the United States has been sharing a lot of this information with India over the last few months, then the Indian authorities would have known that this is coming at a certain point, and therefore perhaps that would have influenced how they were reacting to the Canadian allegations also. Or was it the case, you think, that the US didn't share all of these details with India, and therefore India has been taken a bit by surprise by what's actually there in the indictment?
So I wouldn't know for a fact because not all information is out in the public domain. But I think one can anticipate that I think in India perhaps there would have been sense that more was coming. And I think with the kind of reaction that you saw from the Five Eyes partners, that they're all coming in to support Canada. There were even hints at that time in the media that more information would be forthcoming on this.
Lisa, I guess the point I'm trying to make out here is that perhaps a friendly thing to do for the US also would be to sort of let the Indian government know that, look, there's XYZ information, this is coming out in an indictment, it's soon going to be public information at some point, so therefore you should allow this to shape your reaction. For example, to Canada, maybe you need to have a slightly different reaction to Canada because all of this could come out and you could be perhaps left looking a little embarrassed. Do you think some of that may have been happening in the background?
Well, I think it does seem that the Canadian government raised it privately with Modi first before Prime Minister Trudeau went on the floor of the Canadian Parliament. So, he did raise it, but there were probably complications, right? Because the information about the assassination in Canada came from the United States based on its investigation operation that it was running in the United States. So, probably Prime Minister Trudeau's hands were tied in that he was relying on the US information investigation to complete. So, there's all kinds of legal matters involved. I have no idea what was said behind closed doors. What we do know from the media is that it was raised.
Right, Ambassador Singh, let me just move to the other point now, which is, look, let's not get into the ethical debate of, whether, targeted assassinations or killings are justified or not. Although people will raise that question, they will mention and talk about the point that it's not as if, the other countries, the United States in particular, have not done targeted assassinations on the past. They have. They've repeatedly done it with terrorists who are targeting their interests. Now, in the Indian side, if you read what the overwhelming public opinion is, it is to say, all right, fine, whatever the questions on targeted assassinations are, if the rule of law has to apply, then people making outright terror threats as clearly and as openly as people like Pannun have been doing, including against airliners, including against Indian diplomats, then surely the rule of law also has to extend to finding a way for him to be subject to the consequences of those actions. Questioned, indicted, arrested, brought to justice, something like that.
No, absolutely. I think there is a sense in India, based on facts, based on what people are saying, that elements that are promoting violence, elements that are promoting terrorist activity are given space in Canada to operate freely. And no action is being taken against them because the segments of the Canadian political leadership is dependent on political support from them. And so there is a sense of double standards in terms of how that is approached. And even in the US approach, for example, the US went ahead and, as President Trump claimed, killed the head of the Al-Quds force of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. So here was a killing done of a government official of another country because US has the power. So there is an element of double standards. Or US, for example, took action against the Al-Qaeda terrorists that were acting against the US, or ISIS elements that were acting in the US. US argument is that there was no due process that they were being subjected to.
I would take one issue, though, Arun. I mean, there is numerous documentation against Soleimani. I mean, it was known that he was involved in the killing of US soldiers and others. With Pannun, I mean, is there actually evidence that he was involved in violence? I know there's...
No, I was just actually about to interrupt you to say that you don't have to get any evidence. You've got a video recording of of Pannun, the man himself speaking and making a direct threat. So to that extent, there is evidence. Don't go out and do anything further. But you do have a situation where if you're saying, okay, you can't assassinate a person, you can't kill an American citizen on American soil, you can't come and assassinate, that's fine. But it would be fair for other countries to say, okay, that's fine, but you're taking that position, although you've done something different yourself. But then you must take action against people like that. You must subject him to the process of law, because that is the stance that the US would expect other friendly countries, or Canada would expect other friendly countries to take also, if people are making threats against them.
Well, I think the US does follow the rule of law when it comes to terrorism, but we also have free speech. So I think, one would have to look at exactly what he said and whether it was incitement to violence, and if so, what are the penalties? And I guess if anything, comes out of this disastrous situation, perhaps it's, the FBI will be watching these people more closely and keeping an eye on these fringe Sikh leaders, because they really are part of a fringe group.
Right. Let's get a final word from you, Ambassador Singh, because I don't think either the US or India, for that matter, should be okay with somebody saying, look, we're going to talk about blowing up an airliner, especially when this is the same sort of a group which has done exactly that in the past. So threats need to be taken seriously, or threatening diplomats, putting up posters of theirs and calling for violence. So I guess those videos need to be watched, because that seems to be a direct threat. It's not a freedom of speech issue. Those are direct threats and incitement to violence that therefore needs to be taken seriously.
And Vikram, if I can make 2 points, there is a sense in India that, especially in Canada, but also to some extent in US and UK, elements that are involved in violence directed against India are not really handled with the seriousness it deserves. And very often, of course, the US, from its own reasons, takes actions against certain groups when it wants to pressurize them, and doesn't do it when it doesn't want to pressurize them.
All right. I guess it would be fair to say that neither the US nor India nor any other country should really be okay, I guess, with incitements of violence, because that's not entirely a free speech issue. But Lisa, thank you so much for joining us. Ambassador Singh, thank you so much for being with us as well. We're going to have to leave it there. We are running out of time. Thank you so much for joining us.